from a user mindset point of view, is it like a candy offering or is it like a painkiller? Right? Let's say within retention, you have three basic pillars. One is, of course, activation of a user. Then is building engagement for the user, and then building resurrection.
You're personalizing the content basis the data that the user gave you in that context.
Yes.
If the user is not engaged, the time duration between the install and the next engagement, if it crosses over to, let's say, 3 days, whatever X time frame, then there's a triggered communication with personalized content, bringing the user back in Pinterest.
That's right.
User engagement and retention is a crucial but least understood aspect of growing a successful business. We are here to change that. Hi, this is Ankur. Join me as I dive into conversation with the best and brightest minds in user engagement to help you navigate the why, what, and how of this subject.
Hi everyone, welcome to yet another session for the State of Retention Marketing. Today we have Abhisha with us, who leads growth for the Jupiter Neobank business, from what I understand. It's great to have her here, been a growth professional for some time now and one of the most nuanced practitioners of the subject. She's made an 85-slide deck on how the whole framework of retention has to be approached, which I just got a chance to see a day before yesterday. So very impressed with the whole thought process. Thank you so much, Abhisha, for doing this.
Thanks, Ankur.
Awesome. So, the usual routine, what we'd love to get started off with is a bit of your journey as to how you are here. Growth as a subject is still relatively new.
Yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about your journey till this point.
Sure. So I think the good part about me transitioning to growth space was that I started off my journey as an entrepreneur. So by the virtue of you being an entrepreneur, the default mindset becomes growth, right?
Sure.
So it has to start with a mindset. And with the first stint, I looked at the entire business overall, and I understood different nuances of growth. But the turning point for me with respect to understanding product-led growth, and especially the tech ecosystem, happened when I joined, let's say, Trell, which was back in 2020, middle of 2020, is when I started looking growth from a different mindset altogether. And within this, I started off with sort of understanding what growth really is to start off with, right?
Sure.
So growth is not really a general term now. It's a fairly nuanced term, and it's a fairly technical space now, right? So it's not just about acquiring a user, right? It's also about, let's say, when the user comes to the platform, for the value that you have promised that user, right? Are you delivering that promise to that user or no?
Sure.
As soon as they come to the platform, right? Once you've realized that value, are you making him realize that value again and again to build that habit, right? And once that habit has been built, are you sort of thinking around the revenue angle to it? Are you able to monetize that user? Finally, is that user also able to get you more users, right? And such. So there's a very detailed outlook to thinking about growth.
Sure.
And in fact, my journey started with, first of all, reading a lot around growth space in general. I had to go to the basics.
What you're going to get today is a lot of crystallized knowledge from a lot of conversations and studies that she's done here.
Right. So that was my first attempt to, first of all, identify who were the growth experts in the market. Right from, let's say, reading one of the famous books in Growth Hacker of Sean Ellis, to, let's say, reading the book Hooked by Nir Eyal, to, let's say, going to a platform like Reforge and trying to understand from best in the ecosystem as to how growth is seen. That was my first attempt. And I think once I sort of learned that, then the immediate thing was to start implementing it in my stints that I've had so far, first at Trell and now at Jupiter. And in fact, I've seen that growth typically, again, it's not like a copy-paste mechanism, that you learn that, hey, this is how you approach growth, and then you just copy-paste it. It changes with a lot of context. It changes with who your user is, what they're trying to come for to your platform to solve, right? What is their expectation with your platform? Is your platform, from a user mindset point of view, is it like a candy offering or is it like a painkiller, right? There's a huge spectrum of how the user...
listening the VC language speaking, but
Right. So understanding all of those nuances and sort of trying to understand what is relevant from a user point of view. And I think as we go on in this discussion, we'll try and touch as much as I can in these nuances and sort of try and unlock how growth can be perceived.
Of course. So, growth can be a fairly confused and mixed term as well.
Yes.
And I think the simple way to drill that a little deeper would probably be how teams are organized and how boundaries are drawn and how do you make handshake points.
Sure.
So, could you tell us a little bit about how you've structured this?
Yeah, that's in fact a really good question and an important question. Now, right now, a growth team is not, let's say, just growth managers trying to chase certain metrics and trying to sort of solve for growth of the company. It's not at all like that. In an ideal scenario, it's more like a cross-functional pod.
Sure.
When it comes to a cross-functional pod, we have folks from different domains working together as one single unit.
Absolutely.
Of course, it starts with marketing when it comes to the marketeers being a part of the team. Then we have product folks being a part of the team. We have analytics, which supports with a lot of insights on users, which sort of becomes the fuel for a lot of experimentation that we do as a part of the growth team. We have dedicated engineering as well, right? It's it's an important call out. We have dedicated engineering as a part of the growth
on
team.
Front end, back end, both?
Depends upon the nature of experiment that you want to drive, but that will decide what kind of engineers you'd want to have on the team. But yes, engineers, and also let's say user experience representatives, right?
Sure.
Designers, etc.
But this is like a pod with a bunch of dedicated resources, or these people organizationally structured elsewhere, but then they also assist the growth pod.
So I think different organizations adopt different mechanism.
Let's talk about how you would design it, or how you've currently designed it, and what's your transition journey.
So we operate more in a matrix format, wherein these team members continue to operate in their own individual verticals, but we to come together as a pod, right? And this becomes a growth pod which is responsible for different metrics at given point in time. For example, right now we're trying to chase retention for a platform here at Jupiter. So I think that becomes the high-level objective for a team to solve, and all of us know that we're trying to solve for that metric.
Fair enough.
And this vertical function also helps that they continue to also grow in their respective domains. Let's say the marketing person should know the nuances of marketing, product person should know the nuances of product, and so on and so forth. But together, we're trying to just solve for the same problem statement.
And you consciously choose one problem at a time, or is this like this is a large enough topic to stay on the top of your attention for some time to come?
Yeah, that's again a very interesting question. So when it comes to growth, and it's very important to first of all understand what metric you're trying to chase, right? And let's say in our case, retention being one of the core focus areas. Now, before I even start to work on that problem statement, I need to understand, probably go back a little and sort of get to the basics of understanding what retention is, right? And what defines my retention. And in fact, it has to start from the very basic of who my user is and what I'm trying to solve for as a user. Once I have, let's say, some clarity around who my user is, what problem I'm trying to solve, and how differently I'm trying to solve for that on my platform, that defines my core value.
Sure.
Once I've defined this core value, I have to sort of translate it into a retention metric, right? Once, let's say, I've translated into a retention metric, then I go back to my strategy building, right?
Fair enough.
And from a strategy building perspective also, one thing we are talking about retention, but retention is actually an output metric. It's not an input metric.
Fair.
So that means it will have multiple input metrics.
I'm pretty sure you can all notice the whole academic and rigorous approach to this whole thing. But go on, I'm enjoying this.
Yeah. So now when it comes to even retention as an output metric, what would be their input metrics?
Sure.
Within just briefly touching that, there's again like a lot of depth to it.
Yeah.
But let's say within retention, you have three basic pillars. One is, of course, activation of a user. Then is building engagement for the user, and then building resurrection. So now coming back to your question, right? How do we start? Now to solve for retention, these are my three basic pillars. And amongst all of these pillars, I will have multiple opportunities, right?
So we have the growth pod, which has multiple people. You figured your value proposition to, let's say, make the aha moment in the first experience of the user. Then the value for him to keep coming back in some sense. And you have a bunch of, let's say, hypotheses around this.
Yes.
And this team now gets together to have a data-oriented approach on how to, let's say, tweak or push levers on the user behavior.
That's right. So once I have defined my verticals, within those verticals, I will have different problem statements. It's important for me to size those problem statements and try to understand the impact of it.
Sure.
So
you're
for
not
example,
putting in efforts in the wrong chases.
So let's say, for example, if I know activation as a problem statement, which is basically getting my user to experience the aha moment for the first time, and then getting them to a state that they have formed a habit around my core value. That this entire process is activation.
So funnily, this came up in another conversation which I was having with Karan from Kish, the folks who are running Pay with Ring as an application. So they're a loan business. And their entire story at this point as a company is boiled down to saying that how many people can be moved from the first loan to the second loan. Because that's kind of where the steep has dropped for them. if you've gotten, let's say, X more people here, automatically the downstream funnel start to take care of itself.
Yeah.
So as a
right.
team, the way they're structured and the way they've organized priorities is more around 1 to 2.
Yeah.
What you're telling me is, in their case, obviously, it's a consequence of a bunch of research topics. In your case, we've done a lot of homework on which are the high impact areas for us to kind of push towards.
Correct.
And so, what are the things that emerged as possible growth levers, so to speak?
So let's say if I were to talk about activation in particular, right? Now within activation also, and in fact that's again my nuanced learning around activation now. It's not just about a aha moment.
Sure.
And in fact, let me pick up one of the very interesting interesting studies that I think everybody in the growth system is aware of. How, let's say, Chamath, who was one of the first growth heads of Facebook, evangelized to a metric of getting a user to 7 friends in 10 days.
Sure.
Right? Now,
that's the so-called aha moment which will switch or activate.
So that's an interesting point, that it's not an aha moment.
Okay.
It's actually basically a setup moment wherein a user is forming 7 friends in 10 days to get an engaged feed.
Fair enough.
Right? So you get to a point where you have formed enough connections that your feed starts to become engaging. And when you
this is
engage,
what you call activation?
This is what we call setup moment.
Okay, what was activation then?
So within activation, you have 3 verticals. One is setup, then second is aha moment, and third is habit.
Okay, so in fact, that's all part of activation for you. We will not consider a user activated unless he's reached the habit stage.
Correct.
Wow, okay.
So because if you just get to the user to an aha moment, and then you leave your journey, that means you're literally like you've gone to the cliff, right? And the user can tip off from there.
Fair. In the consumer space, we normally call this the glue frequency. Once you place 4 orders, your repeat rates are at 80%. Is this how this is also derived for you, that once a user has gotten a habit formed in your definition, his re-engagement with the platform will be at above, let's say, 70-80%?
Yeah. So again, when it comes to activation, and I'll try and place it, how is it different from engagement?
Sure.
So activation is getting the user to form an habit.
It's a 0 to 1 journey in some sense, right? From a new user to having the first aha moment, and then the setup moment first, the aha moment next, and the habit part third.
That's next to the habit. So how do you place that habit loop? That, let's say, in case of, let's pick up an example of Instagram or Pinterest, right? Whenever the user gets bored, and that comes a trigger for the user, they by default should open, let's say, an Instagram or a Pinterest to engage themselves. Right? How do you get to that stage of forming that habit, which is not just happen the first time, but keeps happening for a certain number of times, where you are confident that the user has formed habit around it.
Sure.
So that's where your activation actually ends.
It's a very product-centric approach. In fact, for apps for Bharat that Prashant is now building, what they're doing is, if you've set up 3 gods and offered flowers 5 times and gotten these 5 things, you're considered activated. In some sense. So very similar thought process on getting the user from the first time he's come to the application to a certain set of things. I'm going to ask you a bit of a tangential question. Now, you have all of this acquisition efforts going on. You have people installing the app at all times, right? And you associate a cost per install to these topics.
That's right.
Now, that also translates into cost of activated customer, cost of customer acquisition.
Right.
Are you saying that you will only count the activated customers as acquired customers, and then the cost would be measured against that? Or this is still a CPI ecosystem, and it's like it's too messy to do more than that?
Right. No, so definitely we have moved far beyond CPI, right? And we don't attribute to activated as of yet, but we definitely have defined certain critical events for a user to perform, basis which we consider that the user has shown intent to engage with the platform. And basis that metric that we have defined, we calculate our CAC, right? But we continue to measure our CAC to LTV ratio. And that's how we optimize it.
The LTV side is downstream, So what I was trying to understand was, do you optimize campaigns purely on the CPI, now on the acquisition side? Or are you also now saying that, okay, if this guy has not done these 3 things, I don't necessarily value the low CPI.
I think that would be an ideal way to approach it, wherein you look at cost per activated or even cost per retained user.
The eventual perfect state would be that.
But right now we have identified certain critical events, basis which we say that it's not just install, but the user has to get to at least this stage when I consider it to be acquired user.
The so-called metric on user quality that will get fed back to the acquisition team in some sense.
That's right.
If you're getting X number of users and even 5% of them are not getting to this point, you're getting bad users. So switch your things on that side.
In fact, on acquisition side of things, we work very closely with the growth team and the product team for that matter. That constant feedback around what is the quality of the user in terms of they getting to those critical events. That's one. As well as we do very detailed user profiling on various metrics. For example, median net worth being one of the important metrics that we would track from a banking perspective, right?
I'm going to get to the banking side of it. It's a large part of my conversation, so we'll dig deeper there.
Yeah. So those feedback are constantly passed to the marketing team and they sort of optimize for it.
This is very interesting because, one of the things which is not very common, it is, I've seen this happen in the gaming industry where the ROI on acquiring a set of users is measured by the amount of money spent in the game in the next multiple months. But on the other side, in the consumer space, we've not seen people become very cognizant of the repeat rates or the reorder rates when they're measuring CAC. First transaction done, CAC over, topic closed. But that's not enough because 70% of these people will not make a second transaction. So the whole understanding of how to, even measure numbers and assign performance goals, it's a little messy on the consumer e-commerce side of things. It seems to be slightly better sorted to the product side of things, at least in your ecosystem. So now you have your activation steps, which is the step 1, setup, aha, habit.
Yes.
All sorted.
Yes.
And you have a funnel of users who will go at each of these stages. In terms of the engagement and nudges side of things that get involved at this stage, right? From getting the user from 0 to 1, as you would call it, or 0 to habit, as you would call it. What is the structure, process, system? How do you design those? How do you make this happen?
In fact, engagement is in itself a very detailed piece.
Of course.
So when it comes to activation, I spoke about the user getting to setup moment, then getting to some aha moments, and then forming a habit.
Sure.
And these are all data-driven processes where you can define what that metric would qualify as each of these, and there are ways to sort of do it. Now, once you have gotten the user to a habit moment, that's when you start building their engagement story.
Sure.
Now,
so you're saying that is there an intervention from an engagement mechanism at the 0 to stage? Because the guy is probably installed the application, didn't even open it for the next 2 days. So what and how would you approach this 0 to 1 journey? That's what I would love to zoom into first.
Okay.
We'll get to the 1 onwards after this.
Understood. So in fact, that's also very, now that I know what my user journey should actually look like on the platform from the way that I defined. I know that if the user is not taking those actions, that requires an intervention, right?
Sure.
Now, from an intervention standpoint, there can be 2 ways to look at it. One is a user is visiting the app, right? If the user is inside my ecosystem, then I have my ways to sort of, by the virtue of product interventions or product nudges, take them or nudge them towards those journeys. That is one way to look at it. The other way is completely off app. Let's say like in your case, the user has not come at all, has installed and has not come at all, right? That's when I start to sort of look at what could be the possible trigger that I need to sort of create for this user. In that trigger, what hook I need to create, right? And once I've created that hook, then where I'm landing the user and what action that I'm expecting to take. Let me give you an example of, let's say, Pinterest, right? Let's say the user has installed the app and maybe in the onboarding journey, they also take interest of the user, right? He took some interest, but then forgot about the app, right? The immediate nudge going out should be that, hey, you selected home decor and art and craft and few other things. Here's an interesting set of content for you, right? Becomes an interesting hook from a user perspective, right? Instead of, hey, did you forget us? Come to the app.
So that's, you're personalizing the content basis the data that the user gave you in that context. If the user is not engaged, the time duration between the install and the next engagement, if it crosses over to, let's say, 3 days, whatever X time frame, then there's a triggered communication with personalized content, bringing the user back in Pinterest.
That's right.
Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about how you do this at Jupiter?
Yeah, of course. So let's say in case of Jupiter, right? Again, similar to Pinterest, we have defined our own setup moments. First few things that we want the user to do when they come on the platform, let's say one of the first things being that they should fund the account, right? And place some money so that they start to...
there's the KYC wala part also before this, no?
Yeah, so
and
KYC...
there is leakage and to be solved things there also.
Right. So there's a KYC, that's more part of an onboarding journey. Okay. I'm right now talking about when the user has completed their onboarding journey to, let's say, created an account successfully, right? Okay. Once they've created their account successfully, then how do I start engaging them? Now, from an engagement standpoint, I would want the user to first fund their account, right? Or at least come and check out my app to find use cases for themselves. It could be, let's say, around UPI, it could be around debit card, for example, right? So my first nudge would be to let this user place some money in the account, right? And then start to transact. And when the user starts to transact is when I have sort of different aha moments for them. So as and when I see, depending upon how I lay down my journey, that within, let's say, within 7 days, I expect them to do ABC actions. 7 to 15 days, I expect them to do ABC actions. And I don't see that happening. That sort of, then it requires
a set of engagement nudges.
Yes. So based on both actions and inactions, maybe the user came and did not really see the value within the platform, which I had promised. It makes sense for me that the user did open the app, but did not, let's say, find enough value. So it makes sense for me to sort of remind him of the value of.
Because when you talk at the level of scale at which you're operating,
Yeah.
it can get quite subjective and hard to interpret with the whole value prop assessment and
That's
whether the
right.
user got or not. So I came in, you don't know why I came in because I don't know if the search keyword information and all of that is available at this stage
Yes,
to kind of say,
yes.
okay, this is the value he sought
Correct,
when he was coming in.
correct,
So the
correct.
moment he's in, he's onboarding itself as a funnel. So if you have X number of installs, the number of people who will get onboarded
Yes.
is Y. There is
Yeah.
a drop off in between.
Yeah.
And there are interventions that are mostly standardized, but there are still interventions needed to make that
Yes.
onboarding happen completely.
Yeah.
Now, once you've onboarded and this gets more real with the banking equation, then okay, what are the 10 things that this guy should do for this to become, let's say, a setup situation complete? Okay, money loaded means setup done or whatever, those 3 or 4 things.
Yeah.
Money loaded, maybe a bill payment configured, setup
Yes.
done. Now, payment made or accounts added of pays of 5 people is maybe my next step. Maybe I made a payment using the application.
Yeah.
That was my aha moment. So one of those. So I'm trying to understand that, how do you define the user journey at this point in terms of what are the different things? Maybe, the more specific you can talk about the new banking context, the better it gets because then that's where the specifics
Correct.
become interesting.
Correct.
So
Correct.
would love to delve deep.
Yeah. So in fact, I like how you started off with what is the value prop for the user, and in the banking ecosystem, there could be multiple value
Absolutely.
props. It could be as simple as, hey, I just want a savings account, right? Or it could be, hey, I want to explore your lending products, or I want to, let's say, user investment and so on and so forth, right? And the user could be coming with different intent. Like you rightly said, a lot of times the marketing tools, or rather like a Facebook or Google, doesn't really help us pass on that data to the ecosystem. That's a problem that we are all trying to solve for.
Sure.
But while we solve for it, there can be multiple ways to look at it. One is the signal that the user is providing when they come inside the app,
Sure.
right? So let's say if the user has a very strong intent to explore investment, for example, they might show that within the first few days itself, they've gone and explored that ecosystem.
I'm going to push you into saying that he clicked this and he clicked that because
Yeah.
that's as real as it gets in terms
Yeah.
of translating this
Correct.
conceptual understanding to a
Yes.
very trackable, actionable kind of
Correct,
click.
correct. So one is these actions when they
Yeah.
actually go and click, let's say, an investment and they start to explore the mutual funds listed out there,
Sure.
right? But let's say did not take an action.
Huh.
But it's still a signal for me that maybe he has an intent to explore investment. Or let's say could be that I have done various kinds of behavioral modeling wherein I've understood that depending upon how my previous users have performed, I could cluster those users, and based on the clustering that I have done.
This gets very interesting. Yeah. It's a fairly mature thing to do, but we're still talking about your 0 to 1 play. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I should take a step back and understand how your practice has evolved in the last 1.5, 2 years. Because the moment you talk about data clustering and modeling,
Yeah.
it's not something that somebody would do on day 0. You don't even have data to process with.
Right. So I'm talking about, let's say, once I have done clustering of my previous users.
Correct.
And I can attribute
have
the user
enough
on
users
day
to do
one.
this on.
Yeah. So we have
Yeah.
close to
Of course,
almost
now you do.
2 million users.
Yeah.
But going back to the question of when the user has, if you are in a 0 to 1 stage and you do not have enough users, I understand that,
Sure.
that problem statement. The simplest thing to do could be in the onboarding journey itself, if you can take the intent of the user. That's the simplest
Which is
thing to do.
basically figure out what he's clicking, what he's spending time on. In some sense.
That is one.
Huh.
Wherein based on action that the user is performing, you
Huh.
are sort of deriving it. The other one is in the onboarding journey itself. You take the intent of amongst the 10 products that I'm offering or 10 features that I'm offering to you, which amongst them are the most
Explicit
interesting to you.
question.
Explicit.
Okay,
right?
that's kind of how Pinterest asks for the interest subjects. So yeah, you
Right.
could do that, and that'll give you very structured user attribute information in your systems to now work upon.
Right.
Okay?
So in fact, that helps us in a lot of sense, given that on day one, I'm not suddenly bombarding the user with 10 features.
Absolutely, he chose something he wanted, and that's what you offer.
Correct. And
That's
I start off
interesting.
with those 3-4 things.
So, I mean, in effect, on the starting stage, you might as well explicitly ask the user what he wants and then navigate the downstream journey in that direction itself. And it's perfectly okay to do this. Okay, super. So now we have the guy who's been onboarded, and now he has a bunch of, let's say, clicks and behaviors. This is your prior users. You understand that this kind of click behavior would lead into this kind of behavior, which is either desirable or undesirable, and you want to make interventions. Let's zoom into this part.
Yeah. So now, with respect to the interventions that we could plan, like I said, so in fact, when it comes to interventions, if we can break it down into, let's say, 4 buckets. One, of course, is product. Second is notifications. Second is incentives. And third one is, of course, people, right? Your customer support team and so on and so forth. So let's start with each one of them.
Okay.
So let's start with product. Now, when the user is inside the product's ecosystem, and just picking up to a previous conversation, we've identified the user's intent that amongst 10 things that you're offering, he's interested in 3 or 4, for example, right? So on your day one, your experience has to sort of meet those 3-4 things and not 10 things.
Right now, if
Yeah.
I'm not going to name the bank, but it always shows me those exact same 10 options at all times, whether I
Yeah.
pick the first one, second one, third one.
Right.
What you're saying is, in your case, you're able to now reduce the number of options the user sees because you know that this guy is likely more interested in this.
Correct.
If not reduce, at least sort them a little differently.
Yes,
That's
yes.
kind of where a bit of personalization or
Yes.
user experience on the app itself
Correct.
comes in. Okay.
Correct. So that's one.
Hmm.
Now, second is once that you've created the landing experience, then you know what actions potentially this user should take so that they start getting closer to the aha moment,
Sure.
habit moment, and so on
That's
and so
why your
forth.
steering and nudging gets involved.
And that's when your nudging gets involved. So
Huh.
it can start off with, let's say, showing them how to do it. Let's say highlighting the bank transfer, for example, right? It has
Sure.
to start with the discovery of that, hey, there's a bank transfer feature on the platform. So in the entire context of the app, can you highlight that piece and sort of get the user to start engaging with
Let's
that?
go with one example here. Let's say the guy was interested in investments and he went through the mutual fund
Sure.
options,
Okay.
and then we delved deeper into his own journey
Yes.
as to how do you steer him towards the perfect behavior. You wanted him to load the money, he's done that now, and now he's explored mutual funds, and now you want him to maybe invest in a couple of them
Sure.
through your platform.
Sure.
So how does it whole play out now?
So I think in this case, what we could do is can we take some other example?
Absolutely.
But let's talk about building
Transfers?
the user bank transfers, for example,
Perfect.
right? Now within the entire Jupyter app ecosystem, on the landing page you have a bunch of things, but there the bank transfer sits in the payments tab.
One level below.
One level below,
Okay.
right? So on the homepage itself, I have to sort of ensure that I'm creating an entry nudge for the user to explore bank transfer.
Sure.
That is one way to look at it.
Huh.
The other way is bank transfer is also present in a different, let's say, page, which is, let's say, payments, right? When the user organically goes to the payments page, I should show that nudge around bank transfer.
Sure.
When, let's say, the user enters into the bank transfer flow, there are certain steps the user is expected to do. Now, most importantly, I need not be too intrusive as well, right?
Sure.
Let's say I can let the user explore that flow by themselves.
If he's not struggling, you would not.
Yeah, if he's
Tinker.
not struggling or she's not struggling, then I would sort of not
Let him go.
keep it more intrusive, because that also leads to a bad user experience, right? But let's say if I feel that it's been certain time the user came in and did not, let's say, perform that action, then I might want to do some interventions,
Sure.
right? So that is one way to look
This
at
would be
it.
very inspired by how you'll draw out a funnel in a product analytics tool and understand that, okay, this point to this point, the drop off is so much, the average session time is this much, now it's exceeded average session
Yes,
time,
yes.
time for nudge.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. So that's more from a product lens,
Huh.
right? And it can get to the extent of, am I just letting them, am I just suggesting them that you should do it? Or am I giving them a particular use case or guiding them how to use this tool? For example, in case of
Sure.
bank transfer, I could
This
say
is
that.
purely a content topic, right? What would be your nudge textually contain essentially?
Yes.
Huh.
Because that also has to marry
Meaningful
with
delta.
correct. It also brings meaningful delta, and it has to, let's say, also marry with the intent of the user,
Correct.
right? So that's one way to look at it when we look at product interventions.
Sure.
Second one is notifications, right?
Which is in-app, not in-app, the ones that you will send on the device.
Yes.
To
Could
bring
be,
him
let's say,
back to
push
begin with.
notifications. Could be, let's say, emailers, etc.
So multiple channels at play depending on what the user is responding well to.
Correct.
That's triggered at the right time in some sense, because if the user came to the bank transfer page but did not add a payee or
Yes,
whatever,
yes.
then you know that this is a leakage in the funnel at this point. You do
That's
some
right.
sort of a notification around
That's
that.
right.
So there was in-app experiential elements where I'm here right now and there's a certain nudge that's happening because you know that the previous users who've come here have spent only 30 seconds to get to this point, but now this guy's been here for 45 seconds.
Yeah.
So something must happen.
Correct.
And you would do this for the most high impact plays because obviously different parts of the funnel, there's different quantum of
That's
users
right.
and the delta would be
Correct.
a little different.
Correct.
Okay. So your part one was product experiential side of things. Part two was the nudges and notification side of things.
Right.
There were two more pieces that you mentioned
Yeah.
here.
Third, of course, is incentive, right? But I highly suggest to use incentive very carefully, right? By the virtue that you would want the user to perform a action and giving them an incentive. Of course, if you give incentive to any user, they would end up performing that action, right? But it's important to sort of, before you get into that lever, gauge that would a user naturally perform that action. Let's say bank transfer is still, let's say, maybe a second degree of action that the user may perform on Jupyter. But let's say UPI transaction, one of the first few things that they would end up doing on the platform. It may not make a lot of sense for me to incentivize that action, right? So gauging what actions to be incentivized. That's the second piece to it. And the third piece is, of course, people. And I think in case of people,
So let's delve into the incentive bit a little
Sure.
more, okay?
Yeah.
Because it's a very interesting subject. A lot of people have tried to drive behavior change using incentives.
yeah.
And it's usually been a blunt instrument. Give this discount to everybody, irrespective of where they come from, whether they're
Yeah.
anyway going to make that transaction. So, in a quick commerce scenario, if at 7 a.m. I'm ordering a pack of bread, I would have ordered even if you didn't give me that 10 rupees off.
That's right.
So are you saying that you're going to be very cautious about how do you offer incentives for behavior, and you're not like a one-size-fits-all blunt incentive to aggressively grow that particular chain?
Yes.
So it's a more calibrated move.
Right. In fact, I've had some discussions with some of the other growth folks in the industry, and I think people have gone to the depth of, let's say, again, building clusters of users
Sure.
and sort of predicting that each cluster of user, what is the potential ATV that I could derive from them,
Right.
or lifetime value I can derive from them. And if they see the value that this particular user base, if given an incentive, it increases the LTV by, let's say, X percentage.
Sure.
Only then that the offer is sort of given out to
Well,
them.
of course. So the LTV can become a topic of how you measure this whole thing, but
Yes.
at a very simple level. So one of the examples I saw is, if you go to a Starbucks, they have this app, of course, and they also have this MasterCard little table standy now, which is if you tap and pay, you get 100 rupees off. Now, my hunch is they want a lot more people to try tap and pay for the first time. If they experience it, they'll feel happy about it, and next time they will not get an incentive to do this.
Yes, that's right.
To use incentives to change behavior, which is very quickly a good moment, but then the incentive can be weaned off.
Correct.
If they have to keep giving me those 100 rupees to keep tapping my card, it doesn't make sense. But if they can just show it to me once and then it's withdrawn, I'll still continue to tap my card.
That's right.
Is the right way to structure incentives.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That if on giving an incentive, we are trying to change a behavior, but is that behavior sustainable, right?
Without the incentive.
Without the incentive. And tap and pay is like a classic example. In fact, that's one discussion that we have had internally as well, right? You paying via UPI versus tap and pay. Right? Everybody has adopted UPI, but I have come across a certain set of users who still feel between UPI and tap and pay is a more seamless experience.
Slightly more seamless. Yeah,
They just have to pull their card, and it just gets through. So
I don't have to enter password twice. I don't have to open Google Pay or whatever apps.
Correct. And in this case, we were consciously trying to change a habit of a user, and maybe the user may not have done tap and pay without that incentive. Maybe giving that incentive sort of made them do that experience
at least once,
and then they had that aha moment to sustain that.
Correct.
Right.
So in your case, you'll define a set of experiences that you want the user to go through.
Yes.
And that would kind of make the habit sustain even if the incentives are withdrawn in some sense.
Yes.
And is there you mentioned this whole clustering thing telling you about the propensity of the user to make that action even without the incentive or at varying level of incentives. So how mature is this, and is this driven by data in terms of past transactions? How does this whole thing play out?
So I think we are still in our early stages of it.
Sure.
To a fair extent, we have been able to define, let's say, actions which do not require incentivization. That is one. To anybody.
Because incentivization is also going to be a topic as to customer clusters that you're dealing with.
Correct. So for example, a hygiene action of user funding the account, right? That's my first action that I want my user to do. I can't incentivize my user to fund the account, for example, right?
Know, maybe. I mean, you'll have to let data decide some sense.
Yes.
But I mean, what I've learned is heuristics can play a very, assuming your target audience is thinking and behaving similarly to you, then it's okay to apply heuristics there. But in a lot of scenarios, if you're expanding at a certain pace, you have 2 million users now.
Yes.
And the new bunch of people you're acquiring are probably kids from Jaipur, for all I care. 21-year-olds from Jaipur. Yes. They might just choose to fund the account if you give them 100 rupees extra in their account or whatever.
I'm glad you brought this up.
Guess here. So how do you solve for this?
I'm glad you brought this up. And I think the right lens to look at it is, who is my actual customer?
Sure.
Right?
ICP, is there a definition put to it?
Yeah. So we are basically, let's say our core ICP is a salaried individual earning an X amount of money.
That's the guy you optimize for. Everyone else
Correct.
Can be left aside.
Okay? Yes. So who is our ICP, right? Now, if this student is sitting in Jaipur, of course, when incentivized, would end up doing a couple of actions, right?
Which is a very interesting choice made, right? Because you've defined boundaries that I care about this user. I'm not going to try and hack my growth by getting all those kids from Jaipur by giving them 100 rupees to fund their account.
Because that's not sustainable. So they would end up coming, right? But what is the LTV that I could draw from a student?
So what's fun is now for me, Abhisha, the fact that you're using the word sustainable, is that been a language that the company has always spoken, or is this a recent understanding thanks to the ecosystem, the way it's playing out? Because it makes a lot of difference on how you approach growth, right? At the core level.
So I think we're right now talking about a lot of technical things around
I
growth.
agree, but
let
it's
me
just
take
suddenly
even a
went a little
step back.
30,000 feet level all
At
of
a
a sudden.
30,000 feet level, I'm very happy that our founder Jiten Gupta has sort of made it very clear
He's
from day
seasoned.
one.
He knows
He's a
what he's
seasoned
doing.
individual, of course.
Yes.
And he knows that we are building a company for long term.
Sure.
Right? And that's one of the discussions we have had multiple times internally. When we speak to him, he makes us realize that how a 10-year view will look like. And it is always from that thought process. Honestly, I've never seen him even hassled when things go wrong in a day or
Doesn't
at
matter.
a daily, weekly or monthly level. Doesn't
Wow.
matter. But what matters to him is, are we doing the right things which will compound to become what we want to become in the next 10
Which is very
years or so?
interesting because fundamentally, if it's being driven top down, long haul, build sensibly, build sustainably, the business looks very different.
It looks very
In some
different,
sense, you're not
yes.
making all those growth hacks, so to speak,
Yes.
that most people are now
Yes.
using to kind of shoot up numbers in a very, very speedy fashion, not
Yes.
necessarily the most sensible fashion.
Yeah.
So I'm glad it's kind of driven top down.
Yeah.
It's the mandate. And what's also interesting is he's able to find the team which aligns with its thought
That's
process.
right.
Because a lot of people kind of index as a growth manager. If you did not drive 10x growth in 1 year, then you've been like ineffective in some sense.
Yeah.
But I can see that you're fairly aligned with the
Yeah.
long-term play and
Correct.
not take those random shortcuts.
Right.
Because sooner or later that'll come back to bite. So if you were to get all those kids from Jaipur to put 100 rupees in their account by an incentive, that may not necessarily last. They'll probably install and eventually uninstall
Yes.
the app because somebody else will do the same thing.
Correct.
Okay, awesome. So the ICP definition, and within this, are there personas or things that you've yet zoomed into, or is this still let's say going to evolve?
It's still a work in progress for us.
Sure.
But let's say that's definitely a direction we want to go to. We have different, like I said, value props on Jupiter, right? Some people can just come for investment as a use case. There is, let's say, saving instruments on the platform. Some people can just come with a spender, with a saver's mindset that, hey, I want to just save on the platform. Interestingly, we have very good value props around even sorting your salary by the virtue of you creating pots for different use cases. Somebody could just see value in that. We have
So
a very...
from a brand and customer promise point of view, it's still a set of messaging hooks that you're experimenting with. Some of them stick with users and then they get a conversion path downstream.
Correct.
And that's what's currently driving your current growth. Now, of course, it'll start to gravitate towards a few specific things that you'll discover with time.
Yes.
And
But with early on, we're able to pick up those signals of where the user is engaging, right? And based on those signals, then we start to draw their path.
So your job basically starts once the user's in the app, and now let's play with what he really wants to do, and how do we make sure that the journey is the most efficient?
Correct.
So on that note,
I should add one more point, Ankur. One is this data, but we cannot go just blind on data. We have to also talk to the users to be able to understand why they're using the platform. So let's say one of the categorical thing that keeps coming out in a discussion with user is that we offer this feature called spend tracker, where you're able to track your spends, right? So that has come out in so many conversations.
Oh, dude, such a serious pain point to analyze your credit card spends even today.
Yes.
I mean, there's just PDF statements, you can't make sense of them and you can't analyze them over a month.
That's
or
right.
a month, multiple
That's
months,
right.
but fair.
And in fact, just on that insight, you were able to double down. And in fact, there was an insight around how this feature can expand to even their other bank accounts. So user definitely has accounts beyond Jupiter as well.
Even credit cards.
Yes, of course. So let's say, and we introduced that how you would be able to track your spends on other bank accounts as well. And in fact, we saw a tremendous uptick of it in the last quarter. So I think we can't just go blind around data.
Of course.
That
so there'll be user hooks that you'll discover. But tell me something, structurally, how do you have these user conversations? Who does it? How does the insight come in? How does it get systematically absorbed and get into the broad roadmap? Because as you grow, and you're probably a large enough team now, these things tend to get a little lost in the translation, right? Somebody who's reading this and somebody who's designing product strategy may not necessarily be able to connect.
So this is my personal thought process around it. I think in Jupiter we are still growing as a team, and in fact one other team that we are carving out is around user research. And as and when the team forms, I think they will take the charge of sort of taking care of this problem statement, and I'm sure they'll put together a methodical approach, right?
So the only thing I would want to clarify here is the emphasis that again comes from a bit of the top. Because a lot of people, when they want to do this, they'll put small junior time interns on the job to absorb this.
Right.
But I mean, how can you expect that guy to derive the kind of insights that are needed?
Right. So that is definitely one of our important focus area. We're going to build a strong team around it.
Sure.
But having said that, I sincerely sort of request the entire team that I work with, and even me included, I definitely follow a cadence of picking up the phone and talk to users on a regular basis.
So that's your, let's say, direct access to direct user feedback.
Yes.
It might or might not be always immediately actionable, but it keeps you closer to the user in some sense.
Right.
Fair enough.
Right.
So
for
as a growth
example,
leader,
we
that's
were
something
trying
you'd recommend, right?
Yeah, definitely. So in fact, off late we were trying to solve for growth problem statement around debit card, and I wanted to understand what is users' behavior around debit cards or making transactions in general. And one of the insights that came out talking to some of the users were that they've become so smart that along with certain, let's say, categories, let's say for groceries, for travel, etc., they've identified which card offers what kind of offers, and they've literally mapped those cards to that use case, right?
But do you see that as a very common audience? Because these are very quickly going to branch out into several niches and audience segments which have very different behaviors and needs and mindsets, right?
So one is that we cannot approach the blind approach of, hey, my user is not smart, right?
Sure.
So they're definitely becoming more savvy around tech, most importantly, becoming more and more aware by the virtue of everything coming on their mobile phone, right? And in fact, I still remember this one conversation. This guy tells me that he has a credit card and he has a debit card, and on certain transactions he sees that this debit card gives him higher number of rewards, and hence he tends to use the debit card more than the credit card, right? Now internally we can just sit in a room and talk about, hey, credit cards give so many offers, and by the virtue of those offers people will adopt a credit card, but that's not the case. The person who's finally using it is actually evaluating where he gets more rewards.
Fair enough.
So I think picking up those calls is
I'm
important.
going to be now zooming into the parts. So we've done the onboarding and the setup and the the first part of it, which is considered activated.
Yeah.
And that's where the fun part of it starts, right?
Yeah.
Now you have, let's say, 1 million or 2 users.
Yes.
And who have been activated, who have probably loaded money into their account, done some bunch of things.
Yes.
And now there's a user journey to be defined on the LTV side of things. We do this is to eventually make money from you.
Yes.
So there are different things that kind of monetize differently. There are different behaviors that affect lifetime value differently. How do you map this journey out? And this is probably where a lot of banking industry learnings now become relevant and interesting in your space, or how do you approach this?
So I think after having spoken about activation, let me sort of also give some literature around engagement, and then I'll come to how we went about it Jupiter, right?
Very academically done, very rigorous, clearly.
So I think from an engagement standpoint, there are let's say 2 ways to approach things. One is how do you define engagement, and then what is the strategy you build. Now from an engagement standpoint, what we have done is defining what the engagement states of user will look like. So in that sense, typically we break down our users into 3 broad categories. One is our power user, second one is our core user, and third is our casual user. So in different parameters of, let's say, how we define our users on the platform, we sort of
this is to do with some sort of a behavior that he's demonstrating, right? I mean, he's done this, and this, so he's a power user. Or he comes X number of times in Y number of days, so he's a power user.
Let me give you an example. Let's say if I see that the user has activated on debit card, for example, and UPI in the first 30 days, right? And now has gotten to the state of engagement. Depending upon the number of times transaction a user is making, let's say on a debit card or UPI, how I see that frequency histogram internally, basis that I define in which bucket my user sits. Is it a casual bucket, is it a core bucket, or is it a power bucket? The first one is this. Now then when we talk about deepening engagement, now from a deepening engagement standpoint and from a strategy standpoint, there are 2 ways to look at it. In fact, there are 2 ways to look at it. One is, of course, by the virtue of he or she being on Jupiter, I have first objective of the feature that he's already explored, like a debit card or a UPI. How do I increase my engagement there? But that will definitely have a cap to it. At the same time, how do I start to now build their journey on different features? Let's say, for example, a lending product.
Do more of what he's anyway doing and do more things.
Yes.
In some sense.
Yes. And then
like classic upsell, cross-sell as one would put it, right?
That's right. Correct. And then depending upon what signal the user is giving in terms of their intent around exploration on the platform, I start to build that journey, right? So one objective would be, how do I continue to deepen the engagement on the feature that they've already engaged with? At the same time, also take the signals to sort of start to cross-sell the other features.
Exactly at this point, it gets massively fragmented.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And from handling the number of data points and priorities and the people mapping of this gets messy.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this?
It definitely gets messy, but I think what has helped us is probably 2 things. One is that the growth team is more a platform team than a product vertical team, right? So it allows us to sort of disengage ourselves from individual features to rather look at it from a user point of view, what makes sense, right? So when the moment you start to do it, I think you start to sort of think from user first perspective how those journeys could be built. From a product manager perspective, I think if you're a product manager of one vertical, you'll continue to sort of think, how do I increase the engagement on a particular feature
So in your
only.
case, when you're saying product manager, in this case is a guy who owns a debit card business, is that
Yeah,
product
for every
manager you?
vertical, there's a product manager
Correct.
and a business
So
team.
funnily, this is the classic irony of the traditional banking ecosystem because the orgs are designed to be product focused. So the credit card guy is one, home loan guy is one,
Yeah,
personal
right.
loan guy is one,
Right.
and so on and so forth. And these guys don't necessarily have a strong engagement with each other.
Yes.
Their reporting
Yes.
verticals, their growth objectives, their targets and KPIs are all independent in some sense.
Right.
So the
right.
same customer essentially is getting all the different asks from all the different guys which are
Yes.
running independent
Yes.
of each other,
Yes.
which can get messy. And this is it's something that came up in another conversation with somebody from our traditional classic banking
Okay.
ecosystem. And his view was that unless this breaks down, the user experience will not be seamless. Because the user,
That's right.
at the end of the day, is talking to the bank. He's
Yeah,
not talking to
yeah.
bank, a loan division or the credit card division or whatever.
Correct. That's
So
right.
in order to unify these relationships and have one bank talk to the customer, you'll have to have this whole thing broken down into a level where the clusters focus on user cohorts more than they focus on product verticals.
Right.
So you're saying that the growth team that you're running right now is operating like a bit of a platform, which is solving for this situation.
It's more of a horizontal team.
Correct.
So that allows us to sort of think from that perspective to start off with.
But then even within that, the way each of these different users' needs and preferences and journeys will evolve. Like you have as a bank multiple offerings. There's debit card, there's UPI payments, there's bank transfers, there's investments. You're a large portfolio, right? In order to make this meaningful or to be able to create appropriate journeys for each cohort of user, power, core, and casual, 3 segments. But meaningfully speaking, there could be a power user of just one aspect of this, and so on.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm trying to understand the fragmentation of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Because if you have 2 million users, this would mean 500,000 across 4 things.
Yeah.
And
So why?
maybe 250,000 across so many more things. How do you deal with this?
So I think we're still in the process of doing this. Let me sort of
have you defined, let's say, a goal that, okay, this is where we head towards, because all the research you've done would have helped you with something.
Correct. We have definitely identified the process to be able to get there.
Sure.
Now, from that process point of view, and I think although we have
By the way,
multiple...
you're 2 years mature and the amount of stuff you're doing is insanely amazing already. So obviously there's nothing to be defensive about here where you're saying that this is still early days. Obviously, it's a lot of stuff is in early days.
Correct.
Banks have been around for 30, 40 years and they still haven't figured this out. You're at 2 years.
Correct. Yeah, so I think that's also a motivation for us to continue to double down on what we're doing. So that what banks would get to in 30, 40 years, we would want to be able to get to in 5, 10 years. So that's definitely one of our motivation. So with respect to building this, let's say, cohesive journeys for the user, right? And one is getting to a very personalization level. I think there is a long time to get to there. But if we can start with certain segmentation of users, right? Wherein we can identify some common paths that we have seen the user typically takes. So basis that common path, you can define that, hey, amongst this entire pool of 2 lakh users, maybe I see these 3 or 4 segments sort of taking shape, right?
And this is the variables that define these segments could come from a data science kind of an approach, because I mean, logically you might apply a demographic variable to it or a transaction recency frequency monetary value kind of variable to it.
Right.
Or it could emerge as, I don't know, something else, which is somebody who made this exact behavior is suddenly like the most amazing lifetime value.
Correct.
And that seems to be the guy to kind of nudge the most and impact the most.
That's right. So I think, again, we go back to those basics of figuring out those segments. And depending upon those segment of users, where do we see them transitioning or starting to explore or starting to build habit around different features, we try and sort of take that as signals and then start to build those journeys. So that's how we go about it.
So at this point, how many journeys would you be running? User journeys, if you were to define that way.
So we have been able to, we by this time we would have identified broadly 3 to 4 different user segments.
Sure.
And basis these 3 to 4 user segments, we are trying to derive different
The reason I asked that question is I obviously only have examples from the e-com side of the world, and where we kind of started to draw a line on segmentation is where personalization started to make a meaningful role. Because if you talk about fashion as a category, you have the male and the female, okay, 2 segments. So a classic situation, and as a bank, I would rather not name them, would have a bunch of people just making HTML emails because they have 100 odd emails to dispatch 100 odd segments every day. Right? That's kind of how they operate. Now, in fashion and e-commerce and in food, for example, it's insanely personalized. There is no way I can send a message to somebody sitting in Bilandur about a restaurant which is not serving Bilandur. It'll be pointless.
That's right.
So, if you were to start making segments around each locality, you'll go crazy.
That's right.
What you then do is utilize this as an if this then else kind of stuff,
That's right.
and make personalization components out of the whole thing to do this at scale.
Yes.
So my simple thought process is that at a certain point, the segmentation will break, and the personalization is the only way to now scale this up.
Sure. Yes.
Right. So in a communication, when you're doing it, if this guy is from a tier 1 city, then this, tier 2 city, then this kind of communication
That's
starts
right.
to then shape your
Correct.
messaging.
Yeah.
And then automatically not doing a one size fits all blast message, you're doing a very sharply customized.
Yes.
And if you have, let's say, 4 or 5 components of a message, the title comes from one logic, the middle body comes
That's
from another
right.
logic, the second part comes from another logic, the bottom part comes from another logic.
Yeah.
So maybe you here put credit cards, and here you put loans, and here you put something else. And each of them are kind of having a very nice interplay in terms of the user having a seamless single experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not multiple messages, it's the same message which has a certain architecture to it.
Correct.
Which is now becoming like a million users getting a million odd messages. So just to understand how you're playing this out right now and where you seem to be clear that this is the path to go for.
Yeah.
Where are you headed with this?
So I think, like I said, we're still in our early stages to be able to develop this. Right now at a user segment level, but like you mentioned, right? There can be various ways to disintegrate the entire user segment.
Sure.
Let's say it could be where the users come from in terms of geography, what device they're using. Let's say a communication to an Android user and versus an iOS user has to be very different, right? To, let's say, what features that they're engaging on, what behavior they're showing on the platform. Are they showing a saving behavior? Are they, let's say, by the virtue of they accumulating more bunch of their funds around, let's say, saving tools? Is that their behavior, or they would want to rather, or they're using investments as, let's say, one of the core propositions?
Sure.
Or let's say are heavy spenders, and by the virtue of they being heavy spenders, we could help them by giving out the best of offers available to us and so on and so forth, right?
This is clearly a lot of things to be done, right, Abhisha? So what I would love to understand as a part within this, org design wise, you've built a fairly large team last at Trell. There's 100 odd people from what I remember, right?
Yes.
So now in your current agenda at Jupiter, from a team building perspective, capability building perspective, to handle this amount of, let's say, scale and complexity. How are you seeing that play out?
So I should mention with respect to Trell, it was a very different ecosystem altogether.
Content-driven player.
Wherein we were actually having content in 15 different languages.
Sure, that adds to complexity.
Yeah, and by the virtue of we operating in 15 different languages, we had to have representative for each of those languages to be able to build those strategies, trying to understand what that user thinks, what is the need around content, and how do we actually talk to that user, how do we establish that conversation. So by the virtue of that, the team had become fairly large. But with respect to Jupiter here, we are trying to operate more in a lean fashion. We have understood our levers fairly well as to with respect to growth, how do you want to pursue it. Now we are just trying to align the right kind of people to be able to fulfill the skills required to pull those levers.
Awesome. So Abhisha, you've had a fairly interesting journey of the last few months here, but the last bunch of years as an entrepreneur as well as this. Tell me, from a growth management perspective, there are something that you've understood as clear do's and don'ts, and a bunch of mistakes that you might have either made or seen others make and learned from them. Can you zoom into some of these topics that, okay, this is the classic definitely do, and these are classic mistakes that people probably make when they're at this stage?
Got it. So I think probably we can start with do's. We've already spoken a bunch of things around understanding user and trying to identify their problem, etc., etc. But maybe from a more execution standpoint, I can touch one important aspect, which is around how to solve for motivation of a user to engage, right?
Sure.
And I think to solve for motivation, typically the strategies that are adopted in the ecosystem around gamifications, right?
We get to that already. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, right. And interestingly, in the fintech environment, gamification is a slightly more complicated piece. It's not as straightforward as, let's say, it's in case of Duolingo, where by the virtue of you engaging on different things, you collect points and then you show up in a leaderboard, etc. It's not as simple as that, but
there can't even be a forced gamification, because if it's not changing behavior, then what's the point?
Exactly, right? So I think a couple of things that we have done which sort of helped us quite a lot. Of course, we have our own rewards program or in our own coin system, right? Now, one of the interesting things, especially that we had done around our what we call as Jupiter in-app currency, we call it Joules, right?
Okay.
So now, if you think of any reward system out there, just picking your brain, Ankur, what do you think is the most important problem from a user perspective? Think of any
conversion rates, usually.
Right?
Huh.
Exactly. That's the exact problem.
I have like 1 million coins or probably more from a company, which I don't know what to do with. But
right. And from day one here at Jupiter, we had called our in-app currency as as Joules, and 1 Joule has a conversion rate of 1 rupee. 1 Joule is equal to 1 rupee. It is absolutely clear. So we have defined, let's say, how you can earn these Joule internally in the ecosystem of Jupiter by the virtue of you doing various kind of actions. And like we discussed early on, these actions are around let's say which can help build long-term habit or retention of a user, right? And this transparency around 1 joule is equals to 1 rupee was literally was a very important trust building aspect for our users.
So, a very classic play here with incentivizing a certain set of behaviors in very pretty much direct monetary term in some sense, right? But usually when you talk about gamification, it goes beyond monetary incentives because after a point, how much can you kind of keep paying for a certain behavior?
Correct.
What are the other elements within that you played with and you've seen success with?
In fact, I can talk about one very interesting case study. There was the Stamp Wali Diwali campaign that GPay had done in India a few years back, right? And to me, I think that was like a very classic case study from a gamification standpoint. Now, what was first of all the structure of it, and what all did they sort of solve for it via that gamification? The first thing that they defined was by the virtue of you collecting different kinds of stamps. They typically had like 5 different kinds of stamps. By the virtue of you collecting different kinds of stamps, you unlock a reward.
Sure.
And there were 5 different types of stamps, but you could continue to have the same kind of stamp by the virtue of you doing different kind of actions. But once you complete that collection of collecting at least one unique stamp of 5 of them, of each, you unlock, I think, 250 rupees. That was, I think, the reward.
Sure.
And there was a lucky winner angle to it, etc. But I tell you what interestingly that happened. Interesting thing that happened was users, and first of all, let me take a step back. For each of the stamp, of course, there was a clear communication. For stamps, there was a clear communication around what all actions you can do, right? Now, from an actions perspective, also something that was done very intelligently by Google Pay. Of course, it had actions like, hey, you do a scan and pay, hey, you transfer to your friend. By the virtue of you building habits around these things, they also introduce certain actions like scan a diya near you, right? So, what I'm going to say is, by the virtue of the actions that they had, they ensured that there were certain actions that the user can do without any kind of friction. Now, scanning a diya near you is a very simple action for you to perform. So, they ensured an instant gratification. The moment you scanned a diya, you got a stamp, right?
But help me understand this. What is it that they were trying to do out of this? I mean, except perhaps user engagement with the application, metric shayad badh gaya.
So I think there were multiple things that they were eventually trying to achieve. We'll get to that, but let's understand the construct first, right? So from a user perspective, by the virtue of they doing a very simple thing about as simple as scanning a diya, they unlocked certain stamps. Now they got motivated to start doing other actions as well, right? Which included the core actions of GPay, which is, let's say,
so saying if the first action was easy enough, it motivates me to do more
things, right? So let's say then is doing a scan and pay, or let's say transferring money to a friend, inviting a friend, and so on and so forth. So by the virtue
I'm relating it back to your habit formation journey on the activation side. So kind of a multi-step process to make sure the user goes through the aha moment and the setup and the
that's right
habit
stage.
Yeah.
So they continue to do all of those actions and continue to collect the stamp. Now, interestingly, they brought in another twist to the game, and that was amongst all the stamps, one particular stamp, if I remember it correctly, it was Rangoli stamp, which went missing. Right? So there was, and then they brought in an interesting angle of network effect, which is briefly also spoke about, right? So they opened up another scenario of that you could request somebody to give you that stamp. So let's say if I am on GPay and I'm trying to engage in this gamification, and if in my entire collection I only have this one stamp missing of Rangoli, right? They gave me, let's say, a view of who all are my friends playing, what is the stamp collection looking like?
Coming from the contacts data.
Yeah. Right? And then you requesting them to send you a stamp, right?
It's kind of the same as Candy Crush asking me for lives, right? Some cousin of mine who never spoken to me for a while, but now he suddenly want me to give him lives on Candy Crush.
Right.
I'm his Facebook friend.
I still remember those days when on Facebook.
Classic gamification of behavior, but linking it back to business goals, I think they would have had their own hypotheses. What is your takeaway from there? Then?
I think in terms of takeaways, right? Takeaways is when it comes to, let's say, building this entire journey of activation or engagement and so on and so forth, you have to translate them into a gamification, or let's say a strategy wherein the user gets motivated to start to perform those actions on your platform and not otherwise. Let's talk about the context of Jupiter. A user is going to anyway transact, right? Is going to make those expenses. But what will make them?
The money he's going to spend.
He's going to spend
something or the other.
He's going to spend. If not via Jupiter avenues like a UPI debit card, etc., he is going to spend via other platforms, right? So by the virtue of gamification, in fact, we did something very similar on our platform as well, wherein by the virtue of this gamification aspect, what we tried to drive was their spending behavior on Jupiter, by the virtue of, let's say, they doing certain actions, they continue to collect certain kind of in-app currencies, and those in-app currencies lead to, let's say, certain kind of milestones, and those milestones then lead to certain kind of rewards for a user, right?
Sure.
So that's that kind of
So are
a
you going to,
play.
in effect, say that, okay, every time you open the app to scan and pay for something, Jupiter app and not Google Pay linked to the Jupiter bank account, you'll get a certain incentive, maybe.
Yeah, so I think we did it more from a campaign perspective. Again,
Sure.
as a stamp.
You want to spike a certain kind of behavior for a certain period, and all those people will behave differently for the rest of their cohort journey.
However, having said that, what is the game changer here? Let's say these campaigns can let's say occur for let's say a month or two or whatever,
Sure.
right? But what is the after effect of this campaign?
Correct.
Does it really translate
Correct.
into
the change of
into
behavior.
the change of behavior?
Sustained change of behavior.
Sustained change of behavior. That's what is going to be.
So from a do's perspective, you will want to play with alternative ways of exciting or incentivizing the user to behave in a certain fashion.
Yes.
And that's where the non-monetary side of excitement, which is the stamps and this and that. But eventually, it's still somewhat monetary. Have you seen any non-monetary incentives like leaderboards of some kind or whatever else, or bragging rights? In case of Zomato, they have those top foodie and all of that. In your play, have you seen any of these non-monetary incentives to do anything meaningful?
Right. I think so far in fintech, I don't have a classic example at this point in time, but definitely something like leaderboards or badges that you can give to the user at different points in time. Those I think have been used by different apps.
But who is your user? What does he care about? Wale part mein chala jayega.
Correct.
What's the expectation of power user, which is above a salary of let's say 25 to 50 lakhs a year in your app ecosystem in a tier 1 city like Bombay might or might not be the right fit for some of this.
Yes.
So is this something on your agenda to really think through gamification and
That
non-monetary
definitely
incentives
is. That
to kind of
definitely
play it
is.
out?
So in fact, gamification is a strategy. What we're essentially trying to solve for is motivation, like I said, right?
Sure.
And motivation could be solved from various methods. Again, like a classic example of Amazon, right? From an Amazon perspective, when you go and place an order, you would see different elements there which are trying to create that immediate action moment for you. For example, or loss aversion, to rather put it that way. For example, lightning deal.
Yeah,
this deal is
urgency creation for
creating that urgency, right? Or let's say saying that this offer is valid only for today, right? So trying to understand, creating a FOMO.
But is that a part of your play? I mean, that's an e-commerce platform which will have its own set of needs and expectations to drive behavior.
Yes.
But in your case, is sense of urgency a thing?
So I think in case of what really we need to solve for is what actions we want the user to do and what is the right kind of motivation linked to them.
Drive that action.
Right? So let's say, hypothetically speaking, if we let's say imagine that we could actually create, let's say, levels of users from the point of view of financial wellness scores, for example, right? If we come up with such kind of such kind of financial wellness scores, for example, it is nothing but an interesting gamification idea for a user.
Automatically make me bring all my spends here to begin with because I want that data and that scoring to happen.
Yes, correct. So I think what we have to do is bring in context to Jupiter and try to understand what would be the right strategies.
So from what I hear is a year from now you would have figured this out and we should have another conversation to try and zoom in on what needs to happen.
Yeah.
And in your whole thread itself you mentioned the don't make it confusing because if 1 joule is going to be 0.75 paisa here and 0.25 something there, it'll end up being a nightmare for the user to interpret it.
Yes.
Are there more don'ts of that same nature or maybe things you saw as mistakes being made at your level, at your peer level in the industry?
Yeah.
If you could just run us through some of those.
So I think one of the interesting don'ts, or rather something that I would say we should be careful about is the resurrection strategies, right?
Okay.
At any given point in time, we see that there are bunch of users who are dormant, right?
Reality for most of us, right?
Right. So, but amongst those dormant users, how many of them can actually give you a value add in terms of you reaching out to them and they're responding, right? And then if even they come to you, do they retain again for a long term, right? So I think we stop just at sending one, let's say an incentive or an offer to this user base to get them to again come back and transact on the platform, but that doesn't really retain or lead to like a long-term retention.
Those mails have a certain open rate which is usually single-digit low. If you've not opened a mail in 6 months, chances that you'll open now is probably 2%, 3%.
That's right.
There's not much you can do there as such from this route.
Correct. So I think that is one thing that I'm obviously always careful about. Not just about resurrection, but it's also about engagement or any point in time in the user's journey. Trying to understand what will lead to, let's say, a one-time action, but really not translate into a long-term retention. Especially seeing to when we're looking at drawing
saying
incentives.
That you might be able to bring him back for once, but if the core value itself was messed up, he's not going to stick around.
That's right.
But normally, off stalls, and I don't know if you yet able to share this number in some sense. But of all the app installs, there are a bunch of people who never onboarded, never really finished their KYC. Maybe they uninstalled the app, maybe they still have that app lying on their phones. Of all the people who were onboarded, not all of them obviously activated. A usually healthy percentage of these guys ends up not being activated, and they still, you don't really know why they came in to begin with if they did not have to even put money into their account, right? So that's kind of where there's a large pool of dead, semi-dead, uncertainly what to do with users. And to get these guys to engage might still be cheaper than getting completely new installs, or at least getting value. Do you see this in that light?
So I think from that point of view, and if you look at people who have gone inactive, right, there can be people who have consciously explored the app and realized that this is not going to give me value or what I'm going to see.
Yeah, but how do you do this from data? You know, subjectively this makes sense, it's logical, but they've not opened the app in the last 30 days.
Yeah.
Maybe they have money lying in the account, maybe they don't have money lying in the account.
Correct.
Both of these are different scenarios and different kind of possible hypotheses that can be built out of it. As a structural approach to this, what would your take be?
Okay, let's talk about inactive users, right? And inactive users, then we can break it down into broadly 3 buckets. One bucket is people who never activated, right? Second is the dormant bucket, wherein we are saying that these people activated, they engaged to a fair extent, but then they went inactive. And there can be separate reasons for them going inactive. And the last piece is that they have been dormant for a very long period of time, basically a churned user. And these users are not going to come back to us irrespective of whatever we are going to do. Now
and is there a time window to it? Is that all you define as a churn guy? Is there any other metric that you'll also add to it?
I think from a churn perspective, we'll have to look at our data and sort of map in terms of people who have been dormant for different time frames. What is the propensity for them to come back?
Sure. So let's say after 9 months, the chances they'll come back is less than 1%. So you'll call them churn.
Correct.
But, so I was adding the variables to it in terms of, would you say that somebody with an account balance of below X and 7 months since last transaction is there any other variable apart from time?
So along with time, in fact, let me add one more aspect to it. And I think since we're on this topic of resurrection, I think a lot of times we start getting signal that the user is going to become dormant. Propensity to churn early on. So for example, if somebody has tried to reach out to the customer support couple of times in let's say the last 1 week or 2 weeks or whatever, and their query is still not resolved, right? It's a strong signal that the user may want to disqualify.
Very interesting. So you're actually listening into customer support wala pura kahani and bringing that into your growth element as well.
Correct.
It's a piece most people miss.
Yeah.
So I think it's so weird, no? But it's so intuitive that if somebody, and I've had fairly straightforward experiences where I've made a fairly large transaction on a platform only to cancel it 6 hours later because nobody would get back to me on support.
That's right.
Like, dude, that's stupid.
Correct.
But that's the reality of a lot of companies. So you're very conscious that you listen
definitely.
into that customer grievance.
So in fact, those signals keep coming. So for example, if let's say somebody has made a transaction, but the transaction is not reflecting on the app, right? That could be one of the possible scenarios. Now, for a user, it's their money, right? It's not the technicalities that have gone behind to move that money around, but it's about that money reflecting on the app, right? If let's say that has become their query and it's not resolved timely, it will lead to their churn. So some of these signals could come even early on. So in fact, one is that when these things are happening, how do we sort of track it and arrest them right there and then?
To begin with, the data integration. So, your whatever ticketing system data has to come into your dashboards that you're tracking, where the signals get concerned. So, the gold standard of this was an example. I was living in Berlin and then I had just casually tried Amazon Prime. I put the card and some $79 was the expected fees, or euros in fact. I forgot about it. I didn't really transact much. And eventually, at one day, I got an SMS that this transaction has been made on your card. Okay, so I was alarmed that I'm not using it. Why should I pay those $80? So I went to Amazon.de at that time and logged in, browsed around. I made some 3 or 4 clicks. And there was a little button there. Is this about the $79 charge on your card? They knew that this has happened yesterday. There's a good chance I'm going to come back, look for this button. And I pressed that button. They told me that, okay, we can see that you've not made any transactions using this Prime membership. And we're sad to see you go, but if you want the money back, just click here. No conversation needed, no customer care escalation, no anything. But this whole thing was so smooth. So that automatically, one, improved the trust with the platform, two, prevented a lot of hassle from me in that sense, right? And what you're hinting at is kind of similar, that if the customer is behaving in a certain fashion because of something not working or something not going as per expectations, you have to proactively preempt them from a negative experience.
Correct.
Very interesting, but this would have manifestations across a lot of aspects of the org, right? Because if that transaction was made and not really closed. There has to be somebody somewhere solving that problem while you're dealing with the customer's satisfaction as well.
Correct.
If you can zoom into this, I'd love to.
So I think I can talk about two interesting things that we are doing here. One is we have a daily report that comes in with respect to the entire customer experience, right? Where right from tracking like numbers like NPS or CSAT, we also look at top 5 queries that we received, and amongst those top 5 queries, what were the top buckets in which we received the queries, right? That is basically an information feedback for the respective product teams to be able to understand that what are the major problems the user is facing at a product
Sure.
level. So that I think informs the entire team as to how they're faring from a customer experience point of view and
Sure.
not just from metric point of view. So that's one thing that we do. The other thing that I think the customer experience team rather is trying to do is they work very closely with the engineering team on resolution of these tickets.
Sure.
I think they have put together a very elaborate process. I think for
So
that
that's
we'd
the
want our
support
customer
side of things,
experience
which is fine.
head to sort of
Yeah.
elaborate on that. But I think they've worked a lot on sort of solving with the product and the engineering team to be able to solve those queries as fast as possible.
The TAT on supply, the tickets is pretty clearly addressed.
Yeah,
What I was
yeah.
trying to zoom into was the growth team's window into this whole play, because if that guy has just raised a ticket which is still under resolution,
Yeah.
maybe some things will resolve in hours and that'll be a good scenario. Maybe some things will take a little longer because it's technical. You
Yes,
can't necessarily
yes.
commit to having a 2-hour TAT.
Right.
So when the guy is in this process of getting his situation resolved, from a growth communication and nudges perspective / product experience perspective, you're cognizant of this.
To
That's
a
the
fair
question
extent at this point in time, at least, for example, something that happened regularly, unfortunately, are downtowns on the
Sure,
platform, right? As in
happens.
when they happen, it's one of our primary responsibilities to let the user know that, hey, there's a downtime that has happened.
Sure.
Right? Or keep the user informed of whatever query that they're facing on the platform. That is one aspect to it. Second aspect to it is that right now we are still at an L0 level where we get those queries. We know that they're under resolution, but let's say we are not proactively working from a growth aspect side of things, and that's definitely an area for us to explore.
Sure, it's a to-do item.
Yeah,
But you're
yeah.
conscious of it that this is something you want to add. You know, for example, because a lot of people do these feedback exercises. If somebody's got a product, they'll send you a 10-point scale that rate us from 1 to 10. If this guy gives you 1, the story ends there.
Yeah.
Duty give you a 1, do something about it. But
Correct.
that's kind of not where most systems tend to be
That's
talking
right.
to each other.
That's right.
And which
That's
is what
right.
amazes me, that if you're asking for that as a feedback, this is a user attribute information for me to now have in my CRM that this guy rated me 1 last time.
Yes.
There's a good chance he'll either badmouth me or churn or whatever.
Yes.
So I have to make it up to him in my
That's
marketing
right.
communication.
That's right. Yes.
I can't say that you've had a bad experience, but hey, here's a $20 discount, and as if nothing happened.
Yeah.
And that's
Correct.
a piece people seem to miss at a very core level of integrating data from the CRM ticketing systems to the CRM communication systems.
Correct.
Interesting.
In fact, exactly on that note, in the middle of a conversation, we also spoke about user research, right?
Sure.
So one is that you put elaborate efforts,
Of course.
but the users who at least were reaching out to you and are upfront telling you about the
Oh,
experience
yes.
that they are undergoing. It's an opportunity for you to arrest the dormancy of that user right there and then. At the same time, solve for potential users who may face that same kind of an experience. Then I think it all the more makes
So
sense.
that's kind of where I find the banking industry war rooms very interesting. So if you have a slightly dodgy transaction on your card, matter of seconds you get a call that
That's
calling
right.
from the bank
That's
and
right.
you're able to do
Yes.
this.
Yes.
But the scale at which these guys operate to have a kind of good model on
That's
what
right.
needs to be surfaced is very powerful. And I would imagine for any serious consumer app, if there are expecting transactions of a decent size, especially in the banking system, it's pretty like a war room, right? If you have a product funnel and people are struggling at a certain point, you could do that in-app nudge in the product itself, which is probably going to solve it. But if I was going to make a transaction of 3 lakhs and I'm trying to send money to somebody, and if it's getting stuck, I better get a better reaction than that little
that's
nudge, right?
That's right.
So that the whole system of user experience in the product and then the corresponding communication play, whether it's a call being made or an email being sent or a WhatsApp being sent, hey, you're struggling, a live chat session being initiated,
Yeah.
multiple things can happen.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
actually
Yeah,
quite
yeah.
fascinating.
Just
But
one anecdote I want to share
Yeah.
with you exactly on that note, and how we brought Jitain also a couple of times in
Sure.
our conversation. I still remember there was one OKR planning meeting that we had, and in that the customer support team sort of scoped out different asks they had from product and engineering teams, and there were, of course, follow-up questions around how important these problems are, help us
always a
prioritize
topic,
and
right?
so on
Because
and so forth.
engineering is always a stuck backwards.
Right. But I loved how my customer experience team responded, and they said, hey, it's a user's money stuck, right? It is the most important thing in their life. So I think prioritization from a company perspective may be a wrong metric to look at it. And what we really need to think is, how do we solve the anxiety of that user irrespective of in our priority
Sure.
list of things, where does it fall?
And
I think
while engineering will do what it'll do, the communication team can still start to play a role to say that, hey, we understand this has happened and
Yeah.
we will figure out a way to solve it. And
Yeah.
that's why kind of chatbots and all those automated communications to me seem like the interim solution, so to speak, because technology is technology. It will have a
Yeah.
share of glitches every once in a while.
Yeah.
But if you don't comfort the user right then,
Yes.
like there was this app which I was supposed to install one of the car rental companies. The app just wouldn't let me log in.
Yeah.
And this is after 3 car bookings I've made in the last
Yeah.
20 minutes for a fairly large sum of money.
Correct.
And if I'm able to unlock the car using the app, without the app I can't do it. The app just won't install.
Yeah.
So what would I do as a user?
Yeah.
Nobody called, nobody cared. I tried to write to somebody, didn't happen. The next 2 hours I cancelled all these bookings and moved to a
That's
competitor.
right. Yeah.
Dude, it was a seriously large value transaction. But that's kind of what amazes me about how good attention to these little details can actually make a meaningful difference to the user
That's right.
experience
Yes.
and translate into loyalty.
Yeah.
On that note, thank you so much for doing this, Abhisha. It's been a very interesting conversation. We've touched upon a fairly large variety of things.
Yeah.
I hope this was interesting for you as well.
Definitely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ankur.